number one, I guess I want to know, was this an assignment for you? Did Non-Site reach out to you, or is this something that you wanted to do yourself? Because not that Black Marxism is the longest book. It is a dense book. I'm not the biggest fan of Robinson's writing style. It is extremely academic. And being a junior
Right.
college dropout, it's a little over my head.
Right.
But um, what made you want to take this on, or did you pick the shortest straw?
Yeah, I mean it's a long story. So I read this book back in the 1990s when I was a grad student, and I was drawn to it like so many other people by the title, right, and
Mm.
also by the fact that this guy was also named Cedric, right. There were a lot of good things about it, um, and also the fact that he was a political scientist, right. I was in a government and politics PhD program, and it was tough to find other political scientists who would actually write about Marxism in the 1990s. I mean, it was still at that time a subject that was off limits. And so when I stumbled across this book, I had to get it, and I don't think I relate this in the article, but I couldn't afford to buy it, so I remember photocopying a
Damn.
version of it. Probably destroyed my retinas, doing that. But yeah, so I read it back then, because when I saw it, it was so intriguing to me. And then once I started reading it, I realized that it was very different than the kind of book I was expecting. That what I recognized in it, and it kind of resonates with the quote that you just read about the autodidacts from the New Negro period, as well as Black Power nationalists. I recognize a lot of Black nationalism that I had grown up with in the text. Some of the arguments he was making about racism, and really, his criticisms of Marx, I had heard, since teenage years, so since back to the 1980s, and it took me a while to really get to the point where I was willing to criticize it. I mean, the book kind of didn't really become popular until the 2000s,
Yeah.
and even more so with Black Lives Matter. It seems like it really took off then. But
Well, they were trained Marxists, so shouldn't they have known that this book wasn't about what they said they were trained in? Or were they
right,
trained in a different kind of Marxism?
right.
Was there Marxism like the Aikido of Marxism?
Yeah, I have no idea. I think other people call them Marxists more than themselves, right? At least some of these folks.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, what I found out much later is that that wasn't the title that Robinson wanted, right? He
Oh,
he
really?
yeah, he didn't. That wasn't his choice. That was the choice of Zed, the original publisher. But that title actually contradicts what the book is about, right? The subtitle is maybe more accurate, right? It should be, um, the making of the Black radical tradition probably makes more sense as his title. Um, but yeah, I pretty much forgot about that book, right? I mean, it was important to me in the 1990s, and then it's only in recent years as I've seen it kind of take off in popularity. I've been inspired to write something, and like you said, it's not an easy book to get through, and so to write something about it meant having to go back and read it with fresh eyes. And I got pulled into a conference in Brazil, and I think that's where the non-site. That was back at the end of 2023. That's where the non-site article comes from. It was originally written for a Brazilian publication, and then we published the English version in non-site.
Pascal, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, what's really fascinating to me is that, you know, I would have thought that the thing that drew you to write this article was how much bad politics of Black thought today is
Hmm.
driven by this book, and
Right.
how much of the politics of many of the thought leaders, and I think it's safe to say, we, as well as yourself, as well as anyone else in the Reed tradition, have found basically problematic
Hmm.
is takes argumentation from this book.
Hmm.
And, the term that many people would use to describe them now is the one coined by our fellow comrade Troy Reed, is the race reductionists among us,
Hmm.
particularly But the only thing that differentiates them is that they could be race reductionists who call themselves anti-capitalists.
Right.
And what's fascinating about that clique of individuals is that this is the first generation of people who call themselves socialists, I find, who are stuck on the racial element
Mm-hmm.
and deny the overall class and diminish the class element overall and hearken back to the race first socialists of the late 60s and early 70s that you
Mm-hmm.
found. And that's why when I was reading your article and you made the direct lineage, which I've heard the South African allegation that that's where he
Mm-hmm.
got the term racial capitalism. I was always
Mm-hmm.
dubious of that.
Right.
But when you made the clear lineage to the black race first nationalism, particularly revolutionary
Mm-hmm.
nationalism, that, by the way, revolutionary nationalists consider themselves Marxists. Many people
Mm-hmm.
don't realize that. But how much of that politics did stake itself on a racialization of the narrative of history? Your
Mm-hmm.
article clarifies that, and it's clear explaining how much Cedric Robinson draws from that. That is really his origin story, intellectually, is that period of time. And another thing you said that's
Mm-hmm.
important is that he doesn't really explain the black socialists and communists that existed in the early 20th century. He doesn't give them any, he acts almost like they didn't even exist in his book. He pays no attention to them.
Mm-hmm.
And what does this say to this black radical tradition? Who is in the black radical tradition and who is out? Exactly. That's never been
Mm-hmm.
clarified specifically to me.
I think
Yeah, I mean,
Cedric.
there's a lot. What you, I, let me
Can you hear us, Cedric? You're breaking up a little bit.
I can hear you all. I can
Okay,
hear
now
you.
we can hear you. Now we
Can you
can
hear
hear
me?
you.
Or am I still frozen up?
No,
Okay.
you're we can hear you now. So what were you saying?
So let me try to build on what Scott. There's at least capitalisms, right? There's the racial capitalism from people like Bob Blauner, who was a white sociologist who drawed heavily or extensively from Black Power thinking. There's the racial capitalist idea that we get from South African communists. And then there's the racial capitalism as it's developed by Robinson, which doesn't really have a whole lot to do with those earlier notions, which, as I point out in the article, are really more Marxist, right? And then we could also point out that people have taken up Robinson today. They've used the notion of racial capitalism in ways that really don't have a whole lot to do with what he said. There's moments where he's actually anti-capitalist. I would say he is, but in a utopian sense and in a sense that's closer to some of the 19th century, utopian thinkers that Marx and Engels criticized. And so I do think that he has a criticism of capitalism, but it's one which is anti-Marxist, and it's not anchored in this idea of building broad-based, working class centered, political movements. And instead, he's critical of Western Marxism. He's critical of this idea that somehow we can build in the United States or elsewhere broad and powerful, and cosmopolitan social struggles. Instead, he kind of stakes out his claim on something, again, that just sounds very similar to old styles of Black nationalism, this idea that Black people, have a different view of the world, a different perspective, and different ways of knowing, which we need to tap into. and those themselves are important, and what they might pose the alternative to the world that we're in, right? And I think he would probably argue that even Marxists are still committed to some of the problematic assumptions that come out of the making of the modern world. So there's a lot going on there. And I think I would encourage everybody, who's listening, to take up the book themselves. There's some important parts of it. It's a book that I find to be really engaging in some moments, but it's also deeply contradictory, right? So, for instance, in some moments he'll quote people who argue that there was no racism in antiquity, right? There's no racism in Greek and Roman society, right? That there were people, what we might call now people of color, people from Northern Africa, other places that circulated through those Mediterranean civilizations. But there was no racial prejudice because people from Northern Africa did not encounter Greeks and Romans strictly as slaves, right? They encountered them as statesmen, as merchants, as soldiers, and all sorts of different social roles. And so it's only much later, it seems that he's arguing in the original script that racism emerges, right? It emerges during the feudal period. But then in the 2000 preface that he writes, he actually does make the argument that there was kind of racist ideology, or racialist is the term he uses, in antiquity. And he uses, I think, Aristotle to make that point. So there's a lot of contradictory things, and we can summarize some of it here. But again, I would encourage people to take it up and really spend some time reading it, because there's a way that it kind of like says things and then completely contradicts those things in other parts of the text.